everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. Excited to be with you all this morning. Last night was amazing. So I'll do a little bit about myself before we get started, just so you kind of get a feel for where I'm coming from. Like I said, my name is Brit Barron. I grew up in the evangelical church, went to college at a school called APU. Should have gone to CTS, wouldn't be paying these loans though. Should I do that then? I'm black. It's probably the obvious one. Just a note though, since we just had a conversation about black preaching, I grew up in Aurora, Colorado, so just don't expect a traditional black experience this morning. I'm also gay. I'm married to the most incredible woman in the world. She's sitting over there, Sammy Cromlin Barron. Haven't done that official name change. It's a lot of work. And last but not least, in the spirit of open and honesty, I am a recovering megachurch pastor. So I wanted to let you all know that, where I'm coming from. So in my previous megachurch pastor world, after my evangelical Christian college world, I had a moment where I was confronted with this reality that who I was, right? It was in this megachurch that I met my now wife, and so confronted with this reality of, oh gosh, I have built and lived and experienced a really comfortable life in this box, and I am about to be a person who is outside of that. What does that mean, right? I'm sure a lot of us in this room have experienced similar moments where you were handed a box or maybe found a box and it was super cool and awesome, and then something about you or something about someone you love or something you read or experienced all of a sudden put you outside that, and it was terribly painful and uncomfortable, but also the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. And so the story for me had to get bigger. The story of God had to get bigger. If I was going to be included now, it had to get bigger. And that experience is something that I won't take for granted. And then I realized not only does the story for me have to get bigger, but the story was always meant to get bigger the whole time. I started reading scripture and realizing, oh, this is a story, a narrative about God who revealed God's self to a person, then a family, then a tribe, then a nation, then the world. The story has always meant to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, oh yeah, I am a black preacher. All right, got claps in the... Stand up here. And so then, now that's what I want to do, what I love to do, what I will do as long as I am here, is I will tell the biggest story of God possible. Because in a place like Los Angeles, where our church is, in a time like 2018, the story needs to evolve and get bigger. That's how it's meant to be told. And so this morning I want to talk a little bit about how that happens on a personal level, and then how that happens, how I think it might be able to happen on a church level, because as all of you probably know, our church, the church, is in some interesting times, right? Our scripture also has a lot of commentary about the story of God getting bigger, but then at the same time, it's the church that is trying to make the story smaller. Right? It is God revealing God's self somewhere, and the church saying, okay, this is where God is, let's build some borders, and then God being like, what are you doing? No, I am not here, I am not there, I am everywhere and always. And if that's true, what does that mean for church and how we grow and change and evolve? And so to start, I have to tell you a story about Black Panther, Wakanda forever. Yeah. If you haven't seen Black Panther, don't worry, there aren't any spoiler alerts in this movie, or in this story, but you should see it. No spoilers, no spoilers. So I went to see the movie. Actually, I got to go to the premiere a few weeks ago, and it was the second greatest day of my life after my wedding. And yes, it was very. So then I went to see the movie the weekend it came out with my wife, and if you'll remember from my intro, I'm black. And so my wife happens to be white. And so we go and see Black Panther. And within the first 15 minutes of the movie, we're both in tears, okay? And again, this isn't a spoiler. This is You know this from the previews. There's a place that a lot of the movie takes place where black people are thriving. And that scene showing a place untouched by whatever, where black people are thriving, brought us to tears. It's just beautiful, because if you're black or you know someone who's black or you watch TV, that's not the case, or you just heard the previous poem. So we're in tears, and so we leave the movie, and we're talking about the movie and our favorite parts, and we're talking about that moment we had. And my wife grew up in Orange County, also known for its diversity, and so I asked her, I was like, hey, like, do you think if you would have seen Black Panther 7 years ago, you didn't know me, you weren't in any way tied to the black community, still living in Orange County, would that scene have brought you to tears? You know, she's like, no, because the story hadn't expanded yet. The story's gotten bigger for her. It has now included someone that she loves deeply, people that she loves deeply. She has been exposed to an experience that now she understands, that the scene of Wakanda just in the movie theater brings her to tears. And that's how the story expands, gets bigger, and that's how our perspective begins to shift in the world, right? And that's happened for me too. That's happened a number of times. I can think of, we have some friends who have children with Down syndrome, and they have the story has gotten so much bigger for me on the special needs community that I just didn't know. And that happens through interaction, through relationships, through with stopping and saying, this is my community, these are my people, this is how the world works, but being open to say, where is God, where might that narrative shift, and how might that happen? Right, this thing is growing and evolving, and how do we catch up? So there's something, I think, that can happen sometimes in social justice circles with people who, like you and I in this room, people who care a lot about this. Sometimes we can play something I like to call Oppression Olympics, right? You ever heard of it? You know, the LGBTQ community will say something, and then the black community will be like, welcome to the party. You know what I mean? And then Native Americans somewhere are like, you know, and we do this whole thing, and it's a huge barrier, I think, for people who are justice-minded folks. It's a barrier for us in expanding our story and empathy and compassion and what that means. And at a moment where a lot of this really shifted for me in that moment was I was reading John chapter 2. This is the story of Jesus' first miracle. It's the story of Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding. And so, just to recap, you all may be familiar with this story, but I'm going to give you the highlights. There's a wedding. Jesus and Mary are at the wedding. The wine is running out. Mary tells Jesus he will turn this water into wine. He does, and the party rages on. So, with that, a little backstory on Mary, right? Again, just some key highlights. So Mary was a teenager who had the privilege of telling everyone she was pregnant with the Holy Spirit's child. Then no one would let her have this baby anywhere. She gave birth in a dirty manger. So Mary's at this wedding. And I imagine this story of Mary being at this wedding. She looks over, she sees that this couple is about to run out of wine. This is a shameful experience in that time and culture. It's quite honestly a shameful experience now. My wedding ran out of tequila, but a friend jumped on Postmates and saved the day. Different culture, but you know, I get it. So Mary looks over and sees, I imagine she sees the look in this couple's eye, that they're about to experience something that will bring shame into their lives and into their hearts. And I imagine she says, not today. I am triggered by that. I see that. And so I am going to petition to Jesus on your behalf that he do a miracle just to keep you from experiencing any amount of shame, because I have experienced that and I know what that means. Now, just so we're clear, if anyone had the right to scoff at someone running out of wine at their wedding, it was Mary, okay? Oh, you're gonna run out of wine at your party? I gave birth to the Son of God in a manger, you know? If we're gonna play these games, Mary kind of has the one up, right? But she doesn't do that. Instead, she looks and she says, shame is shame and not today. I have experienced this, I have been transformed by this, and I will commit to petitioning to Jesus on anyone's behalf that he perform a miracle just to keep you from that shame. And if we know anything from this world, it's that hurt people hurt people. But if that's true, then transform people transform people. And here's a difference between hurt and transformation. Her transformation, her time with Jesus, told her that it was always right to petition to God on someone's behalf so that they don't experience something I've experienced. And hurt sits in the room and says, I wonder if I'm the most oppressed person in here. Oh, look at them. I wonder if they could even handle what I've been through. I'm going to watch and see. And as people who have been oppressed, been around oppression, been around shame and hurt, and these things from the church, we have two options. We either act out of our hurt or we act out of our transformation. But to act out of transformation, you have to have transformation. And so Mary had that, and it completely shaped and changed the way she saw the world, the way she saw the people at this wedding, and caused the first miracle that we see that should tell us something. She was on to something. She wasn't playing oppression Olympics. She was being transformed and transforming. And I think it's easy when we look at church, we look at religion. When I look at my own story, right, with church leaders, oh, I like to play those games in my head, right? Oh, that happened to you at church? Well, let me tell you about working at a mega church and then falling in love with the production director. I get it, but then transformation. And we're called to transformation. So as I think about that, I think about the story of God always needing to get bigger. I think about on a personal level, our relationships always needing to get bigger, the story needing to expand, the narratives needing to get wide. I think about the church. And I ask myself, what does this mean for the church? Because the church is in interesting times. I think it has always been in interesting times. There was a point, I feel like, in the American evangelical church where they weren't that interesting times. Times I like to call the 90s. I like to call them that because that's what they're called. I grew up in the evangelical church in the 90s. Woo! Said two people in the back, yes. Any DC Talk fans in the house? Yes. So the American evangelical church became pretty powerful, right? We had our own little structures that were pretty comfortable. We had bookstores and clothing lines and schools and churches, and you could kind of exist in your town, but you really exist in the church, and it was powerful and comfortable. Unfortunately, we have an entire scripture that's a commentary on power, and so we see something happening now that doesn't quite add up with what we knew. And so what does that mean? Well, to talk about that, I want to tell you a story about a civil rights leader. So I am obsessed, I'm sure as many of you might be too, with the civil rights movement. I'm obsessed with learning about it, with dissecting it, with finding characters in it who are lesser known maybe. And for several years I've had the opportunity to actually take people to the American South and on a civil rights tour. So we go to the South and we visit sites, we visit museums, and my favorite part is we interview people who were a part of the movement. Mostly people we didn't know, we hadn't heard of. And so one year we had the opportunity to interview this woman named Dr. Gwen Patton. And Dr. Gwen Patton was from Montgomery, Alabama, and she was a part of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was a very integral part of the movement. She was a teenager at the time. Her parents and her family were also very involved in the boycott. Her parents were block leaders. If you don't know what that is, during the boycott in Montgomery, every town, right, not a lot of black folks had cars, and so the ones that did would be assigned a block. And so her parents had a car, and so they were assigned a block. And Gwen would get the grocery list and the prescription list from everyone on that block. And on Sundays, her and her parents would go to the store. They would get everything, and then they would deliver it. That's how organized this thing was. It was beautiful. So the bus boycott lasted over a year. And finally, the boycott was over, and the buses were desegregated, right? This is the movement that was started by people like Claudette Coleman and Rosa Parks refusing to give their seat up on the bus. And so now the buses are desegregated. And so Gwen tells a story, and she says, after the buses were desegregated, I would get on the bus, I would sit as close to the front as possible, and I would find the grumpiest looking white person and sit right next to them. And so she said one day, she got on the bus with her aunt, who was also a part of that movement. So she gets on the bus with her aunt, she gets on first, she finds the grumpiest looking white person she can find, sits right next to them, and then she said she watched as her aunt got on the bus, walked to the back, and sat in the back row. So as she's sitting there, she's fuming, right, the whole ride. So they get off the bus, and she goes to her aunt, she's like, what are you doing? I can't believe you would do that. We fought. People sacrificed their jobs, their lives, their homes so that we could sit in the front of the bus. How could you? And her aunt calmly stopped her and said, oh, honey, I wasn't fighting so I could sit on the front of the bus. I was fighting so I could sit wherever I want to on the bus. I like sitting in the back. And that shut her up pretty quick. And I think about that story and I realize, that's it. That's life. That's ministry, and that's church. We have been fighting and we have been working so that people might encounter God in the same way that we have, with the same songs, the same summer camps, the same schools. And maybe we need to sit back and say, how about we let God encounter people however people are going to encounter God? What might happen if we said, hey, there's a bus. Hey, there's this God. What does your experience with God look like? And maybe if we stop trying to push everyone into the same idea of what they should be doing and how they should worship and when and in what buildings and in what kind of setting, and we said, hey, what does it mean for you to commune with God? I think we would have some dynamic churches. And I think they might not even look like what we think church should look like. We were at a conference, my co-pastor and I were at a conference, and they were talking about 80% of millennials don't go to church. And as a millennial, I get it. No, most of my friends don't go to church. Most people I went to Christian college with don't go to church. And do you know the two things that millennials are doing in record numbers? CrossFit and SoulCycle. They are going to CrossFit and SoulCycle, and as someone who has been and cried at SoulCycle, I get it. It's like, oh my gosh. But the thing is we always say, we talk about this idea of, well, maybe that's not something that should scare us. Maybe we should take some notes, right? What is it about SoulCycle and CrossFit that have been missing from our churches? It's embodied. And when you go to CrossFit and SoulCycle, by the way, you don't talk about the theory of CrossFit or SoulCycle. You CrossFit and you cycle. And there is something attractive to people in my generation who have grew up in this evangelical 90s church where it's very disembodied, right? Body bad, thinking good. There's something attractive about being in a room, pedaling a bike with the lights off, and an instructor asking me, what are you riding for? And all of a sudden I'm crying. Why? I don't know, right? And I'm a pastor. Maybe it's because I haven't had these experiences that allow me to be fully embodied. And maybe we talked a little bit too much about the theory of transformation and not spent enough time transforming. So as we're watching people get on a bus and sit in different places, maybe it's time to stop saying, hey, we fought and we worked and we sacrificed so that you could sit in this seat and listen to this song. And maybe we say, oh, cool. There's a lot of seats on this bus. Get in. And maybe that's the future of the church in the 21st century, is a church that doesn't say, hey, I'm working and fighting so you can experience God in this way, but rather says, man, wouldn't it be great if we all experienced God? And as people, right, as human beings, I'm sure we all have these experiences outside of what we traditionally would call church that have moved us. Well, instead of fighting those or calling this something, why don't we engage that, right? There was something holy about seeing Hamilton. I'm not even going to deny that. I was in that theater like, Jesus is alive and moving in this world, and God is real, and the Spirit is at work. And so if we, again, serve a God and believe in this story that doesn't say, I am here, I am there, but I am everywhere and always, and if God is everywhere and always, well, then the church has a lot more freedom than we thought. And I think for us to survive and thrive into the 21st century, we're going to have to embrace some of that freedom. And that's exciting. It's also terrifying. Because I think for us to embrace some of that freedom, for us to realize what's going on, right, it seems that there are things in the church that seem to be, dare I say, dying. But I think I remember a story about something somewhere that has a little bit of resurrection after a death. And if we believe that after a little bit of death, you get a little bit of resurrection, then this is an exciting time to be a part of this thing, right? And so how do we allow to put in the ground what is trying to be put in the ground so that what is coming out may be birthed and we can live into some of the freedom of a God that says, I am getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the church is just trying to catch up with me. I haven't stopped. This hasn't stopped. We're thousands of years in and we're still trying to catch up. That's exciting, right? It takes a little bit of the scariness out for me as a pastor of a small church plant, right? To look at the trends, and yes, it's a little bit of doom and gloom, but that's what Friday looked like, right? And if we are willing to experience that, because if you will just go with me, you cannot get to Sunday without Friday, and if that's true, we're on to something. And I think a part of it comes with letting the story expand and embracing the freedom that, hey, maybe we haven't been doing all this work so that people can sit exactly where we want them to sit. Maybe we've been doing this work so that the story of God can get bigger and catch up to what's happening in Los Angeles in 2018, because that's a big story, right? Maybe we understand and say, hey, yes, there is Hamilton and Soul Cycle and these things that are bringing something out in people. That's amazing. It's not scary if we understand that God is in that whole thing. And how do we reframe and allow the story to grow and shift our perspective to understand what's happening there? There's the study, the Pew Report, and in Los Angeles, oh gosh, these numbers are mostly right. I want to say that before I say them. Within 10 or 20, these numbers are right. So in Los Angeles, they did this Pew Report in the 60s, and at that time, I think 70% of people in our county, up in Los Angeles County, went to church, but only 10% of them reported having a spiritual experience. And then there was a study, the same study, in 2016, and only 17% of people reported that they go to church, 17, and 65% of people reported that they are having a spiritual experience. Well, what does that mean? It means that God hasn't stopped moving because the churches aren't changing. It means the church has an opportunity now to catch up to what God is doing in the world. And that's a different story. There's not people out there who are saying, I have no idea about spirituality or who God is and I hate it. There's people saying, I'm not opposed to it, I'm just finding it in different ways. Well, that's exciting, and that's a more interesting conversation, right? About how we grow and the story expands. And so that's my encouragement to us all this morning, myself included, is that I firmly believe if we keep telling the biggest story of God possible, we will catch up to something amazing that God has already been doing in the world. And that looks like the narrative growing personally, right? Us exposing ourselves to stories and narratives and perspectives that we didn't have before. And that looks like the narrative growing in the way we see church. And that's a beautiful thing. That's all I got.